Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast episode number 671 for the 15th of August, 2021. Richard Saunders coming to you from, the continuing lockdown here in Sydney, Australia, which has, since yesterday, been extended to the entire state of New South Wales. Yesterday's COVID-19 figures coming out of this state were not good. 466, which is a record, unfortunately. And the fear is that the numbers could go over 500 a day. So, yes, the whole state's in lockdown with new measures being put into place to stop people moving about. You have to have very good reasons to even leave your house. We live in troubling times, which leads us into the first item on today's show, news reports to do with COVID-19 and the reckless action taken by some who think that the law does not apply to them or who think that COVID-19 is a hoax. And these people really aren't helping the situation one little bit. Included in what you'll hear is the frightening story of someone who attacked a COVID-19 health care worker. Following that, it's the newsletter from Australian Skeptics, which we have every other week, written and compiled by Tim Mendham and read this week, once again, by Adrian Hill. Now, hats off to Adrian Hill. She spent a lot of time and effort getting her little home studio all set up with wonderful sound dampening around the place. She's got a lovely microphone, and that reflects quite well, I think, on her, because it doesn't reflect the sound, if you get my meaning. And it reminds me of what our reporter Michelle Bickersmar also has done in her little recording environment, putting up sound dampening on the walls and having a decent microphone and a little bit of practice makes a lot of difference if you're doing a podcast, I think. Oh, and speaking of Michelle, listen out later on in the show, you might hear the Skeptical Fairy. Then to round off the show, a very interesting Trove segment where we look into the case of Jack the Ripper and psychics. And specifically, one story that was repeated quite a lot about a century ago about somebody, a alleged psychic by the name of Lees, with his psychic tips into Jack the Ripper. And this is such an interesting story that I might even do a part 2 next week where we look at more modern attempts by so-called psychics to uncover the identity of Jack the Ripper. We'll see. Now, if you live in New South Wales or Victoria and you're under lockdown, don't forget you can still get out of the house to exercise, which I encourage you to do, and take a nice walk through any local park or garden if you can. You might see some lovely yellow wattle come out, or just soak in the sun for a brief while, maybe while you're listening to the Skeptic Zone. But now it's time for me to run downstairs, and I wonder if there's any chili duck peanuts left in the fridge. Chili peanut duck chili peanuts, peanut chili duck chili. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. What an eventful week it has been since I last spoke to you on the Skeptic Zone in regards to COVID-19 and the Delta variation here in Australia. Every week seems to bring its new setbacks as far as the fight goes, and the numbers over the last week have continued to climb here in Sydney, unfortunately, and now much more of this state, New South Wales, is in lockdown, and Victoria too is facing further lockdowns and restrictions. And what doesn't help? What sincerely and really doesn't help are reports of a man who travelled from Sydney way up to the north coast of New South Wales into the Northern Rivers area, an area known for its large community of anti-vaccination activists. And he travelled with his 2 teenage children while infectious with COVID-19. And here's a report that's come across my desk from ABC News here in Australia. Police charge man who sparked COVID-19 lockdown in Byron Bay. And this is by the crime reporter Mark Reddy and Hannah Ross. And it goes on in part to say, a Sydney man who triggered a COVID-19 lockdown in Byron Bay has been charged with breaching New South Wales public health orders. Zoran Ranovanovic, 52, is receiving treatment for the Delta strain of the virus at Lismore Base Hospital after allegedly driving to the popular holiday destination from his home in Rose Bay last month. And Rose Bay is a rather nice, plush, well-to-do suburb of Sydney. His teenage son and daughter are also being cared for at the hospital after testing positive. The story goes on to list a number of sites that are on alert, as it seems the family visited those sites, including in the tiny, tiny, tiny little town of Bangalow in that area. And Bangalow is probably the very heart centre of a lot of anti-vaccination activity. We read that the family failed to use the QR code system when visiting businesses along the way. And according to other reports, he is also being uncooperative with police about his trip and other matters. And now we look at some more information, some more news about COVID-19, and a story we've been covering for some time now in the Skeptic Zone are the protests, the Freedom Now anti-lockdown conspiracy theory protests that have plagued cities in this country. Although the last huge one threatened for Sydney some weeks ago turned out to be a complete and utter flop, as barely anybody showed up. And the same sort of thing has now happened in Melbourne a few days ago. And here's a story dated the 12th of August. Police arrest dozens of anti-lockdown protesters despite poor turnout. And we find this at news.com.au, written by Matthew Murphy. And it says in part, Victoria Police showed up in force to combat anti-lockdown protesters in Melbourne's CBD, Central Business District, downtown, but the event was a total fizzer, with more police and media attending than dissidents. Despite the poor showing from protesters on Wednesday night, police told news.com.au that they arrested 73 people for breaching lockdown rules. And a spokesman is quoted here as saying, police had a highly visible presence in the CBD and were pleased that the majority of Victorians did the right thing and stayed home. Controversial right-wing activist Avi Yemeni made his presence known, arguing with police and interviewing the small number of protesters. That's interesting. We got far-right activists and far-left activists all joining hands together. The lacklustre protest came hours after Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews announced a week-long extension of Melbourne's lockdown after the state recorded 20 new cases of the virus. And there are some interesting photographs as we scroll down this story. One of the photographs is one of the protesters has a flag on a flagpole over his shoulder, and the flag is a snake with the words, "Don't tread on me." It's more and more apparent that a lot of these people think they actually live in the United States of America. And a posting at the group on Facebook called Reignite Democracy Australia says, the Melbourne protest was a flop. However, there were thousands of police running around the city like lost puppies. Maybe that's a win. So what they're saying is that if they waste police time, then that's a win to them. I see. It says also, look on the brighter side. Last minute, cold weather, lockdowns, it's harder to get people out under those circumstances. Don't be disheartened. We live to fight another day. With another posting elsewhere claiming that the protest wasn't a flop. The police just upped their game. They stopped trains and diverted trams to stop people coming in. The people were there. Apparently not. And finally, one more story covered in the Sydney Morning Herald, but widely covered on the media in the last week. And this is a story by Sarah McPhee, and it was updated on the 11th of August. And this is the very, very troubling story of a man who attacked a healthcare worker as she went about her duties at a COVID-19 testing centre. A man has been charged after a female COVID-19 testing site worker was allegedly verbally abused and punched on the head in Sydney's northwest. The woman was working at the testing clinic on Kissing Point Road, Dundas, about 4 p.m. on Monday when police say she was approached by the 50-year-old man who was not wearing a face mask. The police say here that they have been told the man began filming the 31-year-old worker on his mobile phone before verbally abusing her about vaccinations. The man then allegedly dislodged the woman's mask and punched her to the head. Police will allege the man came up to one of the workers, pushed a telephone into her face, dislodged her mask and struck her in the face, said some horrible things, and then left the scene as others came to help the lady. Officers arrested the man at his home in Telopia in Sydney's west just before 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday. He was taken to Granville Police Station where he was charged with common assault, 2 counts of possessing a prohibited drug and breaching the public health orders. The man was granted conditional bail to attend Parramatta local court on September the 28th. And I have seen other reports that suggest, and just a note of caution here, anything that is before the courts in this country, we have to be very careful about what we say. So it's been suggested or alleged that he was saying some sort of conspiracy theory, anti-vaccination things along the way. Whatever the case, we can imagine that some people in our community have been completely fired up by viewing anti-vaccination conspiracy videos online, reading propaganda, that they feel empowered to grab their phones and run around filming people to confront them about the COVID-19 hoax and whatever. And in this case, we say possibly, allegedly, it's resulted in the physical assault of a healthcare worker. But yeah, well, what's the harm in believing conspiracy theories? And just harking back to that flag, "Don't tread on me," this is known as the Gadsden Flag, and according to Wiki, the Gadsden Flag is an historical American flag with a yellow field depicting a timber rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike. Beneath the rattlesnake are the words, "Don't tread on me." Some modern versions of the flag include an apostrophe. The flag is named after politician Christopher Gadsden, 1724 to 1805, who designed it in 1775 during the American Revolution. It was used by the Continental Marines as an early motto flag. It is sometimes used in the United States as a symbol for gun rights and limited government. Yes, that's all very well and very interesting and a nice little piece of historical information. But people running around in protests in Australia waving that flag, again, they're just simply seeing things on the internet and maybe they want to move to America. I don't know. It's a bit weird. Well, good luck. We can't go anywhere at the moment with the COVID-19 restrictions. Partly thanks to people who run around waving flags at protests, extending the lockdown for everybody. Anyway, that's just a little wrap-up of some COVID-19 related news coming out of Australia in the last week.
drinking. Hey, drinks, hey.
So nice to be back at Skeptics in the pub.
Yes, Richard, it's great that COVID-19 is a thing of the past and we can gather together and not wear masks. Although I will occasionally, in special situations, you know what I mean, don't you?
This beer tastes better than I remember. And this beer glass is much bigger than I remember. Oh, thanks for this. I'll get the next round.
No need. All the beer is free tonight.
Free? Oh, wow.
Did you hear that all the anti-vaxxers and flat earthers have changed their minds?
What? Really?
Yeah. They're now busy writing apology letters to the whole world. They're really busy. They're going to have to sharpen their pencil, if you know what I mean.
Look. It's Lara coming over here with a plate full of food.
Hi, you two. Did you know that the food at the bar is free tonight? Anything you want.
Really?
You have to try the lobster and chips.
Lobster and chips? Oh, wow. This is like a dream.
And this pub now has recliner chairs, a free foot massage for everyone, and vouchers for Uber rides home.
Wow.
Hang on. This seems too good to be true. Who's the guest speaker? It's not bloody Brian Dunning, is it?
Let me see. This is odd. It says here it's the skeptical fairy godmother angel from the internet.
The skeptical godmother fairy in... You know, that sounds familiar.
Smoking it up, woman.
Hello, everyone.
Who are you? What, you're only 10 centimetres tall. That's about 4 inches for those of you using the Darth Vader Imperial system. And floating in the air, that can't be right.
As Lara said, I'm the skeptical fairy godmother angel from the internet.
Ask a silly question.
And you're tonight's guest speaker?
Well, not really. I have come to tell you that, yes, this is all a dream.
I thought this was too good to be true.
I know we can't meet in pubs at the moment, but that shouldn't stop you from enjoying skeptical talks online. The Vic Skeptics have Skeptics Cafe each month. Sydney has Skeptics in the pub. There are online events from the Gold Coast and...
Yes. This all sounds eerily familiar. Have we met before somewhere?
Maybe we have. Maybe it was as we watched a live and interactive skeptical talk. All you need do is search for them online, no matter where you are in the world.
She's right. I've been watching skeptical talks from the UK, the US, and even one from my own living room. Although that one wasn't very interesting. I fell asleep and I was the speaker.
Hang on. Weren't you once the Tooth Fairy?
I'll never live that down.
One last question.
Yes?
Just whose dream is this?
Mine. Goodbye.
It's worse than sparklers.
She disappeared.
But, we're still here, huh?
Right. So, lobster and chips, anyone?
All right, now it's a dream you want to pay for everybody.
Hello, everyone. This is Adrian Hill, and this week I'm reading the highlights again from the Australian Skeptics newsletter, written and compiled by Tim Mendham. This is newsletter number 129, which was posted on the 10th of August. Hi all, it says. The Innovative Skepticon Joint Australian and New Zealand Conference is just around the corner. Well, 3 months away. Info on speakers and ticket prices will be available soon. But in the meantime, why not nominate a winner for the Bent Spoon? Read on. Tim. And remember that each story comes with a to read more when you subscribe to the newsletter. Bent Spoon nominations. So nominations are now open for the Australian Skeptics Bent Spoon Award, one of the least sought-after credits in the skeptical world. Or any world, for that matter. I wonder who it's going to be this year. Can't wait to find out. Skepticon. Register your interest now. Registrations of interest are now open for Skepticon, the 2021 Australian Skeptics Annual National Convention, which this year will be held on November 20th to 21st. It will be a joint event held by Australian Skeptics in Sydney, Australia, and the New Zealand Skeptics in Wellington, New Zealand, with face-to-face and online participation available, COVID willing. Note that, of course, should the current situation in Sydney regarding COVID and lockdowns continue, then we may be forced to have an online-only convention for the Sydney component. Details of the speakers and ticket prices will be available soon, but in the meantime, please register your interest at skepticon.org.au so you can receive the latest information. $11 million unlawful advertising penalty sets a record. A supplier of unapproved sports supplements has been fined $11 million as the Therapeutic Goods Administration points out their potential to damage health. The Federal Court of Australia has ordered Evolution Supplements Australia to pay $11 million for unlawfully advertising a range of unapproved sports supplement products, including reference to steroids, selective androgen receptor modulators, or SARMs, and pre-workout products containing DMAA and other amphetamine derivatives in breach of the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989. Oxygen Therapy Company fined $550,000 after death of customer. Oh dear. An alternative health practice and its clinical director have been fined a combined total of nearly $727,000 following the death of a customer in 2016. Former chiropractor Malcolm Hooper and hyperbaric oxygen therapy provider OxyMed were each convicted of 3 work safety-related charges, all of failing to ensure a workplace is safe and without risks to health. Hooper was fined $176,750, while the company was fined $550,000. The customer was a long-term client with multiple sclerosis, MS-induced epilepsy, and a history of life-threatening seizures. Pete Evans, remember him? Selling his health lab less than a year after it opened. It was meant to be a new chapter for Pete Evans after being dumped from his TV gig, but the controversial cook's latest venture is a flop. The 2-time Bent Spoon Award winner is selling his health lab business to Byron Bay less than a year after opening for a below replacement price advertised at $295,000. The Evolve Health Lab try and say that 5 times fast. The Evolve Health Lab was launched in September last year and offers services such as a cryotherapy chamber where people expose their body to low temperatures, red light therapy, and a hyperbaric treatment chamber. Sky News 1-week YouTube suspension over COVID misinformation. Sky News Australia is serving a 1-week suspension from YouTube after the video platform's review of the channel's content. Old YouTube videos on Sky News Australia's channel have been taken down for violating COVID-19 medical misinformation policies. Sky News has rejected that any of its television presenters deny the existence of COVID-19. India's first paranormal helpline reveals spooky ghost encounter claims. An interesting and apparently highly successful activity from Indian skeptics. The country's first and only paranormal helpline, set up in January 2020, successfully attended 1,000 calls per week recently. It was started by The Paranormal Company and aims to spread awareness against superstitions. From calls made out of curiosity to people calling to share their paranormal experiences, the helpline has heard all types of bizarre and spooky accounts. Speaking about the idea behind setting up a paranormal helpline, paranormal investigator Jay Alani said, "The main purpose of this paranormal helpline is to cut down the blind faith and superstitions as much as possible by telling and showing people the reality and logical reasoning behind the apparent paranormal events that they claim to have witnessed." Anti-vaxxers getting support thanks to Christian crowdfunding site. Oh dear. Vaccine deniers with large followers are turning to crowdfunding platforms, both the relatively obscure Give, Send, Go and the mainstream GoFundMe, to fund their activities, often to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Give, Send, Go describes itself as a place for Christians, a place to fund hope, a place to pray and connect with the body of Christ around the world. A place not only to raise money, but a place for givers, senders, and goers to work together to be the light of the world. It's quite something. The real story behind Australia's urban legends. Urban legends told around campfires or in school playgrounds help form local identities and reflect the culture and history of the places they grow. That includes paranormal topics like yowies, big cats, and ghosts. UFOs and the boundaries of science. Excellent and long article on the history of UFOs and their proponents and the belief system that support them. The June 2021 issue of The Skeptic is out with a major feature on why people believe, as opposed to what they believe, what psychologists and science leaders think, the legal implications of holding beliefs, and case studies of the victory of belief over reason. We also look at the myths and conspiracies associated with the Port Arthur Massacre, that tragic event, which occurred 25 years ago. And the article everyone has been waiting for, A History of Sydney Uni's Oxymetrical Society. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time to do so. Contact the editor if you're not sure if your existing subscription needs renewing. Your input is needed. If you have any ideas for stories or want to contribute to Skeptics communications, such as the magazine or Facebook page, or just have something you want to get off your chest, then you're welcome to get in touch. News leads should be sent to newstips@skeptics.com.au. Submissions for the magazine, etc., should go to editor@skeptics.com.au. Comments and suggestions, even rude ones, should also go to editor@skeptics.com.au. I'm guessing it goes to Tim Mendham. Items of interest. How to tell if a clairvoyant is real or a scammer. Or how to give tips to scamming clairvoyants so they can pretend to be real. Travel tip. Are these the 9 most haunted places in Ireland? You know, the usual suspects: castles, forts, lunatic asylums, and old houses. Except for the vampire buried in County Derry, vertically and upside down. There is more to read in this newsletter, and it can be delivered to your inbox every other week by subscribing at www.skeptics.com.au.
Hi, I'm Ben Radford, co-host of Squaring the Strange podcast. In these trying times, as we help each other out to hold on to hope, we want you to know that we're here for you.
Hey, what are you going on about?
Who's interrupting my heartfelt promotional copy?
It's me, Celestia Ward, your co-host. Really? In these trying times? That's the best you can do?
Well, I'm just doing what everyone else is doing. I thought...
That's not what we do.
Oh, for crying out loud, who else is here?
Pascual Romero, your other co-host?
Hey.
We don't do what everybody else does, Ben. That's kind of our thing at Squaring the Strange.
Yeah, we try to approach things a little differently than your standard skeptical talky talk show.
We do our own thing, bringing science, critical thinking, and skepticism to bear on issues of the day. We've got a professional skeptical author, Ben, who has decades of experience researching topics for a dozen books and thousands of articles.
And a cartoonist skeptic, Celestia, who knows her stuff when it comes to facial weirdness and the psychology of perception.
And a badass heavy metal rock star and tech engineer, Pasquale, who brings knowledge of all things audio, plus a bunch of neck tattoos.
Squaring the Strange explores topics both mysterious and mundane through a critical lens. Monsters, panics, media literacy.
Okay, forget the whole trying times promo idea. But we have chupacabras and clown panics, right?
Yes,
Ben.
Now it's time once again to look into those archives at trove@nla.gov.au, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia. Digitised newspapers, gazettes, periodicals, magazines, journals. Did I say newspapers twice? I can't remember. All at your fingertips and fully searchable. Now, it may interest you to know that ever since the Trove segment started sometime last year, these are the subjects that have been covered. Alien abductions, astrology, the Australian skeptics, the Bent Spoon, as in the Bent Spoon Award, biorhythms, clairvoyance, debunking, ESP, flat earth, full moon and crime, Uri Geller, haunted house, Houdini, Into the Unknown, which was a 10-part series of so-called tests way back in the late 40s, early 50s, James Randi, Loch Ness Monster, the New Age and Skeptics, occult, Ouija boards, poltergeists, psychic animals, psychic predictions and the Bay Area Skeptics, psychics and America, psychics and fraud, psychics and murder, psychics and police, psychics and testing, quackery, Carl Sagan, Scopes Monkey Trial, superstitions, telekinesis, the National Centre for Science Education and Eugenie Scott, UFOs, water divining, witchcraft, and yowies. Which brings us to this week's subject, psychics and Jack the Ripper. Yes, Jack the Ripper, the most notorious serial killer in all of history, although there have been many who have killed more. It's Jack the Ripper that sort of caught the public imagination way back in the 1880s and is still very much the image of a serial killer even to this day. Now, just quickly, according to Wikipedia, Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer active in the largely impoverished areas in and around the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. In both the criminal case files and contemporary journalistic accounts, the killer was called the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron. Now, it is unknown, there are many things unknown about this case, but it's unknown how many people Jack the Ripper actually killed. 5 poor victims are listed, but there could be more, and it's not clear when he began his killing. And it goes on to say, attacks ascribed to Jack the Ripper typically involve female prostitutes who lived and worked in the slums of the East End of London. Their throats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations. The removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims led to proposals that the killer had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. Goes on to say the name Jack the Ripper originated in a letter written by an individual claiming to be the murderer that was disseminated to the media. The letter is widely believed to have been a hoax and may have been written by journalists in an attempt to heighten interest in the story and increase their newspaper's circulation. The From Hell letter received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee came with half of a preserved human kidney, purportedly taken from one of the victims. The public came increasingly to believe in a single serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, mainly because of the extraordinarily brutal nature of the murders and the media coverage of the crimes. And you can imagine the wiki page is extensive with information about Jack the Ripper, as are the many videos available on YouTube about the subject, documentaries over the decades. And more than one of those documentaries involve so-called psychics with their psychic insights to identify Jack the Ripper. And so, lest we treat the subject too lightly, the known victims, or the believed victims of Jack the Ripper, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And none of those women, of course, deserved to die in such a brutal fashion. And this leads us to the first of the returns when I searched for Jack the Ripper in the Trove archives. Jack the Ripper plus psychics, or clairvoyance, or the paranormal, those sort of things. And we turn to the pages of the Kalgoorlie Miner from Monday the 14th of August 1922. So something in the order of 34 years after the crimes. Solving murder mysteries. Psychic methods. From our special representative. London, July 6th. Dr. Abraham Wallace, a well-known London specialist and psychologist, asserts that murderers can be discovered by psychic methods. Speaking at a lecture this week at the International Congress of the Spiritualists' National Union, Dr. Wallace said that as a result of his experiments and observations, he was now disposed to believe that in a properly constituted circle, with one or two fully developed sensitives, all meeting with one accord to discover truth and to repress evil, every murderer might be discovered, and, but for the probable sequel of capital punishment, the information obtained could and ought to be utilized. The Jack the Ripper murders were another instance in which Dr. Wallace claimed that psychic methods were successfully employed. The culprit was found to be one of the rare cases of double personality and belonged to the medical profession, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Owing to the interposition of a high authority, the homicidal maniac was removed to an asylum where he died many years after. I understand, says Dr. Wallace in this connection, that the sensitive, a friend of mine, first got into contact with the murderer while riding in an omnibus. A voice told him to follow a man sitting opposite, as he was Jack the Ripper. He did so, because the voice informed him that the murderer intended very soon to do another outrage in a certain way. He then communicated with the police, who were disposed to suspect him as the murderer. He requested them, therefore, to keep him under observation till the next murder took place. This they did. Thereafter, they listened to his statement without questions, and acted accordingly. The criminal was taken, the series of murders terminated, a great public excitement ceased, and nothing more was heard of the case. Incidentally, Dr. Wallace opposes capital punishment. There is no proof, he says, that it tends to diminish crime. Rather, it tends to produce crimes of a singular character occurring in epidemics. Now, if you recall, dear listener, a couple of weeks ago on the show when I was talking about psychics and murder, I think it was, the account of the man on the bus was also mentioned. Now, let's go to the year 1936, some years later. The Daily Standard from Brisbane in Queensland on the 21st of January. Jack the Ripper. Clairvoyant's clue to his identity. Crime and the supernatural. Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London in the late 80s, was a distinguished surgeon, a venerable Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, according to Edwin T. Woodhall, formerly of Scotland Yard, in a new book, Crime and the Supernatural. Now, as I read this, just keep in mind that some of these older newspaper reproductions are a little bit faded here and there. Mr. Woodhall is not a spiritualist, but he quotes many cases in which mediums have pointed the finger to a murderer, and one of these cases is the Ripper crimes. Writing of Jack the Ripper, he says, "In a black Japan box in the archives of the British Home Office are the confidential papers concerning the identity of the most mysterious and spectacular murder of the past 100 years. He was never brought to justice, and it is commonly believed that the police were as ignorant as were the public as to who this prowling, maniacal butcher really was." But even in those early days, there were officers at Scotland Yard possessed of vision and imagination, and when completely baffled and in despair, for press and public were inveighing hysterically against the failure to lay the murderer by the heels, a well-known clairvoyant put certain information at their disposal. It was investigated, corroborated, and seized upon, his affording Scotland Yard a new avenue in their inquiries. Seen in a trance. Mr. Woodhall claims that the Ripper was tracked down by a clairvoyant named Robert James Lees, and that authorities were in possession of all the facts. Nearly 50 years ago, unknown to the general public, a court of about a dozen well-known medical men of the highest integrity and standing held an inquiry concerning the alleged insanity of Jack the Ripper. It was definitely proved that he was a physician of high standing who lived in a select part of the West End. When the multiple murderer's actual identity was proved and his homicidal mania definitely established, all parties were sworn to secrecy. The clairvoyant, we are told, in a sort of trance or vision, saw the first Ripper crime enacted when an unfortunate woman was done to death in Spitalfields. Mr. Lees was so horrified at the terrible dream or trance that he had seen with his occult eyes that there and then he went and told the whole thing to Scotland Yard. His story was accepted with incredulity, but the officer on duty made a note of the time and the place, and there the matter was allowed to end. When the clairvoyant was abroad on a holiday, the Ripper added 2 more victims to his list, on August 31st and September the 8th. Shortly after his return to London, says Mr. Woodhall, the clairvoyant was riding in an omnibus. Here's the omnibus again. With his wife, when at the top of Notting Hill, a man entered the vehicle, and almost as he did so, the clairvoyant felt the singular, numb, powerless sensation which had overtaken him previously. As he looked across at the far corner where the man had dropped into a seat, he felt icy cold as his gaze met, for one brief second, the eyes of the fresh passenger. Leaning over to his wife, he said, "That man in the opposite corner is Jack the Ripper." The clairvoyant followed the stranger when he had lighted at Marble Arch. He appealed to a constable to arrest him, but not unnaturally was merely laughed at. Meanwhile, the man hailed a cab and disappeared. Shortly afterwards, another crime took place. The clairvoyant, we are informed, was taken to the scene by the inspector in charge and a number of policemen. Presently he rose, and his eyes stared into vacancy, moved off rapidly in a westerly direction. He had picked up the psychic trail. Followed by the officials, he walked mile after mile, never once hesitating, until he reached a street in the West End of London. Here, outside a big, imposing-looking house, he stopped, reeled, and would have fallen but for the support of the inspector. "In there!" And I'm sorry, the next word is completely obliterated. So it would be he cried, he yelled, he said. The murderer. Human bloodhound. It is said that the police believed this human bloodhound and, taking a chance, entered the house. There, says Mr. Woodhall, his wife told them the truth. And just a warning, there's parts of this which are illegible, but we'll try to connect the dots. This man, one of London's most distinguished doctors, had a dual personality. Normally, he was just what I have purported him to be, a physician, his life and talents dedicated to the alleviation of suffering. Abnormally, and of these occasions, he had no recollection. He was the... And the next line is practically illegible, I'm sorry. He was the something, and the words are just sort of melted away over the years. But we'll pick it up. Who had Whitechapel and sent a thrill of horror throughout Europe. The doctor, after being certified insane, was placed in a private asylum. To account for his disappearance from society, it was announced that he had died suddenly from heart failure, and funeral rites were actually conducted. The clairvoyant, quote, for his wonderful public work, end quote, received, quote, until the day of his death, a pension from the privy purse, end quote. Mr. Woodhall remarks that he has no actual proof of the truth of this story, but during my years at the yard it was more than once recounted to me as I have related. And finally we go right back in time to 1895, so not even 10 years after the murders, from the Warwick Examiner and Times in Queensland, published on Saturday the 14th of September. Jack the Ripper discovered. A clairvoyance theory. Recent disclosures in the remarkable case of the notorious Jack the Ripper have challenged at least the attention of police officials to the fact of the assistance which clairvoyance, when executed under favourable conditions, may render in the detection of criminals. To Robert Lees, an Englishman, a man who from boyhood has possessed extraordinary clairvoyant powers, is due the credit of having solved the problem which has puzzled the entire police force of London, notwithstanding the fact that there has been a standing offer of a reward of £30,000, together with a life pension of £1,500 per annum, for the man who should first deliver to justice the terrible Ripper. These combined efforts proved fruitless until Mr. Lees appeared on the scene. The perpetrator of these startling crimes proves to have been not, as was first supposed, a man in the lower walks of life, but a London physician of high standing who practised amongst the best of society in the West End of London. The name of the man whose mental aberrations have resulted in these disgusting crimes has not been disclosed. In fact, he is, at the present writing, a violent lunatic, an inmate of a private asylum in Islington, who was considered the most intractable and dangerous madman confined in that establishment. We further learn that the most extraordinary precautions have been taken in this strange case to save the reputation of his family, that in order to account for the disappearance of the doctor from society, a sham death and burial were gone through with, and an empty coffin, which now reposes in the family vaults at Kensal Green, is supposed to contain the mortal remains of the great West End physician, whose untimely death all London mourned. None of the keepers know that the desperate maniac who flings himself from side to side in his padded cell and makes the long watches of night hideous with his piercing cries is the famous Jack the Ripper. To them and to the visiting inspectors he is simply known as Thomas Mason, alias number 124. With these preliminary statements, let us consider more especially the part played by Robert Lees in the identification of the predator of those horrifying murders. At the time of the first 3 murders by the Ripper, Mr. Lees was at the height of his clairvoyant powers. One day, he was sitting in his study in London when he became convinced that the Ripper was about to commit another murder. The whole scene rose before him, and he became aware of every detail of the contemplated crime. So impressed was he by what he had thus miraculously witnessed, that he at once went to Scotland Yard and delivered the whole matter to the detectives. On the following night, a woman was murdered in the Whitechapel district, under circumstances identically the same as those previously stated by Mr. Lees, the occurrence taking place at the same hour and in the same locality, as seen clairvoyantly by him. So shocked was Mr. Lees by this verification of his prophecy that his health became seriously affected, and by the advice of his physician, he for a time removed his family to the continent. Upon his return to London, he was riding one day in the company of his wife in an omnibus from Shepherd's Bush when he became clairvoyantly impressed with the idea that a man who had entered the vehicle at Notting Hill, wearing a soft hat and light overcoat, was no less a person than Jack the Ripper. He leaned over and whispered this belief to his wife, who laughed at him and told him not to be foolish. "I am not mistaken," replied Mr. Lees. "I felt it." Shortly after, the man got out, and Mr. Lees, telling his wife to remain, followed him. He soon met a constable, to whom he pointed out the man, saying that he was the dreaded Ripper, and asked that he be arrested. The constable laughed at Mr. Lees, and threatened to run him in. Presently the man called a cab, and if struck by some presentiments of danger, jumped into it and rapidly disappeared. We have not the space for all the interesting details of the manner which, amidst many difficulties, Mr. Lee finally obtained the confidence of the head inspector of police at Scotland Yard. Suffice it to say that he did so win his faith in such exceedingly irregular and unofficial detective methods as those of clairvoyance. Mr. Lees consented to try and track the Ripper, much in the same way as the bloodhound pursues a criminal. There seemed to be some magnetic wave connecting an impalpable sense he possessed with the fugitive. All that night Mr. Lee submitted himself to this strange influence and traversed swiftly the streets of London. The inspector and his aides followed a few feet behind him. At last, at 4 o'clock in the morning, with the pale face and bloodshot eyes, the human bloodhound halted at the gates of a West End mansion, gasping with creaked and swollen lips. He pointed to an upper chamber, where a faint light yet gleamed. "There is the murderer, the man you are looking for. It is possible," said the inspector, "that this is the residence of one of the most celebrated physicians in the West End." A colloquy ensued. Mr. Lees, as a preliminary test, required by the inspector before entering the house, described in detail the interior of the hall, even to the dog asleep at the foot of the stairs. The police entered the mansion and learned, as a matter of fact, that he had just returned from one of his most terrible murders. And during the course of the half an hour's most searching examination of the doctor's wife, who was a beautiful woman, she confessed she did not believe her husband was of sound mind, and there had been moments where he had threatened to kill her and her children. She had noted with heartbreaking dread that whenever a Whitechapel murder occurred, her husband was absent from home. Later developments and admissions from the physician himself resulted in his arrest, and, as heretofore stated, his final incarceration in the private lunatic asylum above mentioned. But wait a moment. Upon further investigation, I have discovered something else about this strange case of the psychic and the surgeon or the doctor. At a website called casebook.org, which has a lot of information about Jack the Ripper case, we find a list of suspects. Listed is Thomas Mason. And the report here says, Thomas Mason. On the 28th of April, 1895, the Chicago Sunday Times published a story in which it was claimed the medium Robert Lees had received a psychic impression of the Whitechapel murderer. 17 murders later, the police asked for his assistance. Throughout the night, Lees followed a psychic trail which ended at the house of an eminent physician. The story goes on to say that the police questioned the doctor, his wife, eliciting the admission that the doctor suffered from occasional losses of memory and had on one occasion regained it to find his shirt blood-stained. Proof of his guilt as Jack the Ripper was found in the house, and he was committed to an asylum in Islington under the name Thomas Mason 124. Author Stephen Knight identifies Thomas Mason with Gull, and I'm not sure who Gull is at the moment, though misdates Mason's death as 1896. The real Thomas Mason was a 71-year-old retired bookbinder from Islington who was born in 1817 and who had no connection with Gull or Jack the Ripper and was never incarcerated in an asylum. He died in 1902 from bronchitis. It's interesting that there are quite a few references to Robert Lees in connection with Jack the Ripper, and it may be that they all stem from the same source material and just reported and re-reported and retold over some years. But the list of suspects in regard to Jack the Ripper is extensive, and it is, as I've said before, like a weird sort of rabbit hole. Once you go down that rabbit hole, there are endless mazes and clues and information and dead ends and all sorts of things. While it is extremely unlikely, bordering on probably impossible, that we will ever really know the identity of Jack the Ripper, if indeed it was one person responsible for all the crimes, I sincerely don't think we're going to find that elusive information from the mind of anyone claiming to have psychic power. I almost think there should be an automatic caveat whenever a psychic or somebody claiming psychic powers says words to the effect of, I have helped police with so-and-so case, or I help police. The word help should be crossed out with big red ink, and what should replace it is the word hindered. Once again, thank you to the people who spend many hours, I'm sure, digitizing newspapers and gazettes and articles and reports and magazines so everybody around the world can benefit from diving into that trove of information. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. Now, one more quick reminder from our friends at the Canberra Skeptics. On Monday, the 16th of August, here in Australia, so that's tomorrow here in Australia, which will be Monday, from 6 p.m, that's Australian Eastern Standard Time, you can hear Dr. Brad Mackay talking about fake medicine, exposing the wellness crazes, cons and quacks, costing us our health. Always a fascinating time with Dr. Brad, a very well-informed doctor he is, and you can find out more about that talk, which you can attend via Zoom anywhere in the world. Just head to CanberraSkeptics.org. A big shout out to my friend Dr. Angie Matke, who is doing it tough at the moment as an emergency physician working out of Ohio at the moment. And a big shout out to all the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers out there around the world who are having a particularly bad time at the moment. Because you can imagine, with lots of resources being stretched to the limit with COVID-19 patients, it means everybody else is also being stretched to the limit. All the other emergencies and other health issues are all being impacted, which makes all those people who are conspiracy theorists when it comes to COVID-19 or evil vaccinations or whatever a little bit hard to take at the moment. Speaking of conspiracy theories, one of the stories coming up on next week's show, I'm going to be looking at some 5G conspiracy nonsense and an unfortunate and ridiculous full-page ad, full-page in a local newspaper in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, which was full of 5G conspiracy theories. How this page was ever allowed to be published is beyond me. And finally, thank you to those people who are continuing, despite everything else, who are continuing to support the Skeptic Zone financially at PayPal or Patreon, and you can do that by visiting www.skepticzone.tv. And I know a lot of people in Australia and Sydney, Melbourne, and the rest of the country are doing it hard at the moment. A lot of people have lost their jobs. You know, it's not a good situation. And as I've told you before, all my other sources of income have stopped now because of COVID-19. All the things I did, and especially galling is the fact that for the second year running the Mystery Investigators show I do with my friend Maynard and Ian Bryce and other people over the years, the show where we teach students all about the mysteries of the world as or through the lens of the scientific method. And it's just been a passion of mine for nearly 20 years. And apart from anything else, it's regular income every year. So that's all gone. Thank you, COVID. Thank you, COVID. The gift that just, anyway. So again, thank you to those people who can still contribute to the show. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Lockdown, Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
So, Susan, can't you get access to a large photocopier scanner where you can just stack them all nicely and just put it in and they all just churn
Well, that's
through?
what I was doing. I have one.
People are being very rude and making fun of Susan.
Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, I have one of those.
And me.
Sitting right here.
They're making fun of my laugh.
Oh, they're making fun of Adrian.
Your laugh. We love
We're
your
not making
laugh.
fun of your laugh. We're making
You
fun
have a
of
wonderful
your
laugh.
Folks, we're doing the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project once again, but we keep lingering on after the official end every week and just chat about things, mainly about COVID. This week, folks, this is the dice game, of course, the part of the show where you get to predict using your psychic powers or dumb luck what number will come up. I'm holding it up in front of the crew here on Zoom so they can all see it. It's a D10. Sort of a marbly sort of D10. What numbers will come up? I wonder, Susan, would you care to make a prediction?
I think I'll pick a 5.
Ooh, shocker.
5.
Shocker.
All
I
right.
think I need to take the Susan approach, except just go for 666 every time after our last segment.
Odds
Okay.
are just as good as mine, which are been crap.
Anybody else want to have a guess?
4.
5.
4, 5.
Good
Michelle?
things happen in threes.
Oh, I was going
Or
to
bad
say
things.
3.
I heard some podcast segment that disputed that, I think.
What do you say, Michelle?
3.
3. Here it comes.
sticking with it.
Here it comes. First roll of the die. Here we go. Okay. I'll hold it up to the camera so you can all see.
Yes!
5.
No!
It's a 5.
And the crowd goes wild.
And the second roll. Here we
Crowd
come.
named Susan.
Predict away. What do you say?
4 again.
5.
5. Here it comes.
I'm going to do the luck does come in 3s, even though that can't happen now, and just stick with the 3.
All right.
Yeah, 3.
6.
Oh,
Nobody
there you
had
go.
6, I don't think.
There you go, Kelly. Yeah, Kelly had 6.
Oh, Kelly, I'm sorry.
I had 6. That's right.
Last one coming up.
Sticking
5.
with a 4.
Okay.
3.
3.
And it is 6.
Oh,
Kelly.
almost 6.
Kelly gets 2 out of 3.
Wow.
Today's
Almost
winning
6.
numbers
I'm
are
impressed.
5, 6, and 6. And thank you all once again for your tremendous effort over many months with the Great Australian Prediction Project.
You're very welcome.
We want to see a book out of it.
Yeah, me too.
No book. No book.
There better be a book.
Right up. Right
I
up.
The Great Australian Prediction Project by Richard Saunders.